When Anna Stillwell runs her fingertip over a faint name engraved inside her late husband's wedding ring, she doesn't realize she's about to unlock a story that stretches across oceans, decades, and broken promises. She thinks she buried all her tears when she laid him to rest in that quiet corner of the Veterans Care Center, until this single clue forces her to confront the past he never spoke of, and the life she never knew he had. Stay until the end. What would you do if your beloved carried a hidden piece of someone else's heart? If you believe in the enduring power of love that transcends war and time, give the story a like and subscribe for more. Anna Stillwell once believed her life with Peter would continue in the same gentle rhythm forever. They had met in the summer of 1970, introduced by a mutual friend during a church fundraiser in downtown Minneapolis. At the time, Anna was finishing a nursing program, and Peter was newly discharged from the Army. He was quiet, almost painfully so, but there was a steadiness about him that made her feel protected. She'd noticed him right away, partly because of his broad shoulders and the silver strands in his hair despite being only in his late 20s. He seemed older than his years, as if the world had worn him down. Yet when he smiled, there was a flicker of warmth that hinted at a different man beneath the exterior. They started courting in the simplest ways. A weekly walk by the Mississippi River, an occasional Sunday meal after church, a few shared jokes that neither of them repeated to anyone else. Anna found herself asking him about his time in Vietnam, but he always deflected. "I'm glad to be home," he would say, leaving it at that. One night, she pressed him a little more. She had studied enough history to know the war had been brutal for many soldiers, but she also believed that talking might help him heal. He gave her a small, sad smile and said, "Some things don't survive the trip back. I'd rather leave them where they were." It was such a quiet, pained admission that she never pushed him again. They married the following spring in a small ceremony. Peter asked only 2 Army buddies to attend, men who stood in the pews with subdued expressions, their own eyes carrying distant memories. Anna's parents were supportive, although they found Peter a bit too reserved, hoping he would come out of his shell as the marriage wore on. Still, Anna felt an abiding love grow between her and Peter that neither words nor gestures could fully express. In time, she learned how to read the subtle shifts in his mood. He would never be chatty, but when he made breakfast on Sundays, scrambling eggs and warming her teacup on the stove, she sensed that was his way of showing devotion. They never had children, a quiet sorrow that Anna carried more than Peter. In the early years, she'd wanted a big family, but fate didn't grant that wish. After some miscarriages and an exhausting cycle of doctor's appointments, they let the dream go. Anna sometimes wondered if war wounds, physical or otherwise, played a role, though she never dared to ask. They funneled their nurturing instincts into the local community. Anna volunteered at the church's soup kitchen, while Peter quietly helped neighbors fix broken fences, clear driveways in winter, or repair leaking roofs. Folks in the neighborhood knew if something needed doing, you could count on Peter to show up with his toolbox, never asking for payment. That was just who he was. His experience in Vietnam remained sealed off. She noticed him flinch at fireworks or go silent when war coverage flashed on TV. Occasionally, she found him alone on the porch at night, staring into the darkness. When she placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, he'd squeeze her hand in return but say nothing. She understood it was his burden to carry, and loving him meant accepting that certain parts of him would remain a mystery. Their home was a modest, one-story house in a suburb outside Minneapolis. Surrounded by maples and a neat lawn, it felt safe. Anna, working part-time as a nurse at a nearby clinic, would return home in the evenings to find dinner already on the table, roast chicken and vegetables, or a hearty stew that Peter had perfected over the years. The neighbors joked that Peter was too good to be true, and Anna always smiled, agreeing that she had somehow landed the rare kind of man who loved fiercely in his own quiet way. He was around 70 when his health began declining. It started with shortness of breath and an occasional cough. Anna recognized the symptoms of a weakening heart, but he downplayed them, insisting he just needed more rest. One winter evening, she found him collapsed on the living room floor, struggling to breathe. That night marked the turning point. The doctors discovered advanced congestive heart failure. He needed constant care, more than Anna could provide on her own. He moved into a veterans care center on the outskirts of town, and Anna visited him daily, bringing homemade soups and reading to him from the local newspaper. The staff adored him, always remarking that he was polite and never complained about the pain. They spent the next few years navigating the slow inevitability of his decline. On their 50th anniversary, they sat together in his small room, with the sounds of beeping monitors in the background. He held her hand, kissed her knuckles, and whispered, "Thank you for everything." 2 weeks later, in that same quiet room, he slipped away in his sleep. Anna stood there, heart aching, tears streaming down her face, holding onto his cooling hand. She felt the weight of all those unspoken histories between them. She only hoped he'd found peace in the end. The funeral was a simple affair, just as he would have wanted. A military chaplain read a brief eulogy, describing Peter as a dedicated soldier and a loving husband. The color guard performed a dignified flag-folding ceremony. Anna accepted the folded flag with trembling hands, her eyes brimming with tears. She tried to imagine him as the broad-shouldered young man in uniform, and she tried to picture that part of him she'd never fully known. When it was all over, she walked away from the cemetery with an ache in her chest, feeling as though she'd lost half of herself. A week later, she received a package from the care center, a small box containing Peter's personal effects, his leather wallet, which held only a few faded photos of them at the Minnesota State Fair decades earlier, the Timex watch he wore daily, its band scuffed by years of use, and a separate envelope containing his wedding ring. She lifted that ring, which he had worn faithfully, turning it over in her hand. At first, she just admired its warm gold sheen. Then she noticed it felt oddly heavy, as if the metal contained a secret. Curiously, she peered inside, expecting to see the usual engraved dates, or maybe her initials. Instead, she found a single word etched there, faint but undeniably present: Lynn. She stared at it for a long time, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. It wasn't her name. It wasn't any name she recognized. She recalled how, at the start of their marriage, Peter had mentioned that his original ring was lost in Vietnam. He'd replaced it with one he'd had done quick in Saigon, nothing fancy. She never questioned that story. Why would she? It had never occurred to her that the ring might have belonged to someone else or symbolized something else. Now, in her quiet kitchen, leaning against the counter, she felt a sense of disorientation that left her breathless. Who was Lynn? The name lingered in her thoughts. Could it have been a mistake? A random engraving that came with a used ring? She tried to dismiss it but found she couldn't. The idea nagged at her, a locked door in her husband's past. She wasn't angry. It was more a feeling of being thrown off balance, as if she were seeing her steady, beloved Peter through a new lens she couldn't quite focus. Unable to rest, she spent a sleepless night roaming the house, turning on lamps and then switching them off again, sipping cups of tea she never finished. By morning, she felt hollow but determined. She climbed into the attic to search through old files, rummaging behind boxes of Christmas decorations and dusty albums. She found a battered filing box labeled VA Peter Stillwell. Inside were various papers from the Department of Veterans Affairs, scattered medical forms, and some older documents from his time in the Army. She also discovered a single green envelope, its corners warped by time, containing a letter. The handwriting on the letter was rushed, uneven, and obviously old. It read, "Still no word on the girl. Embassy says evac failed. No way she made it. God help him. He still believes she did." It was unsigned, but the bottom corner was marked with a name, Ellis Doyle. Clipped to the letter was a small black and white photograph. She lifted the photo with trembling fingers. It showed Peter, younger and broader, standing next to a Vietnamese woman who looked to be in her early 20s. She was holding a baby, a tiny bundle pressed to her chest, and both mother and child were smiling. The photograph was grainy, the faces somewhat blurred, but Anna recognized Peter's gentle expression. The woman's face was unfamiliar, but there was something eerily reminiscent of Peter's posture in how the woman held herself. Anna's heart hammered. She turned the photo over, searching for a note, but it was blank. She stared at that woman's smile, that baby in her arms, and recalled the name engraved inside the ring. Lynn. Could this woman be Lynn? And the baby, was it Peter's child? Her hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped the photo. Every question she'd ever had about Peter's time in Vietnam came flooding back, demanding answers. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with both wedding rings in front of her. The simple gold band she wore for decades, and the heavier ring with that single engraved word. She also had the photograph lying between them, as if bridging two separate realities. She asked herself if she wanted to pursue this mystery. Peter was gone. Investigating the past might only reopen wounds she couldn't heal. But she felt compelled to understand who her husband truly was. She loved him still, but she needed to reconcile this new revelation with the life they had shared. The next day, she phoned the VA, hoping they could connect her to anyone familiar with Peter's unit or old Army records. Her inquiries were met with polite confusion or bureaucratic deflection. After several transfers, she landed on a woman who sounded about her age, kindly empathetic. Anna mentioned the name Ellis Doyle, explaining that she had a letter signed by him referencing an evac attempt. The woman fell silent for a moment, then gave Anna an address for a man named Ellis who might match the profile, residing in a veterans community near Sacramento. Anna wrote down the address, her heart pounding. She didn't hesitate. The next day, she booked a flight to California. Friends and neighbors told her it was too hasty, that she should take time to grieve, but Anna felt as though she'd spent her whole life avoiding these questions. Peter's final gift, or perhaps his final challenge, was to show her that her marriage was only one part of his story. She packed a small suitcase, tucked the envelope with the letter and photo inside, and boarded a plane with trembling hands, half excited and half terrified. She arrived in Sacramento late in the afternoon. The air felt warmer than Minnesota's crisp fall breezes, and the sunlight had a baked, golden quality. She rented a small car and drove out to the veterans' home, which was a modest complex of small apartments. The building exteriors were plain but well-kept, with potted plants lining walkways. She found the apartment number the VA contact had given her. Knocked. An elderly man opened the door, supported by a walker. His eyes were cloudy with age, but they held a spark of recognition. He studied her face for a moment, and his mouth parted. "You're Peter's wife," he said, sounding certain. Anna didn't know how to respond, so she just nodded. He introduced himself as Ellis, stepping aside to let her in. The apartment was cluttered with old books, half-filled coffee cups, and dusty medals displayed on a cabinet. It smelled of stale coffee and the faint chemical tang of old cleaning solutions. She handed him the photograph, the ring, and the letter. He looked at them without surprise, as though he'd been waiting for this encounter. After a long silence, he gestured toward a small kitchen table and offered her a seat. He poured coffee into chipped mugs, apologized for the taste, then settled across from her with a sigh. "I always wondered if you'd come," he murmured. "I wrote that letter decades ago." Anna's mind buzzed with questions, but she let him speak at his own pace. He began by describing how he and Peter had served together, stationed near Da Nang in 1969. "That was a rough place," Ellis said. "We were out on patrols most days. Threat of ambushes every time we moved. Civilians were caught in the middle. Peter hated it. Hated the confusion, the not knowing who was friend or foe. We lost a lot of good men." He paused, taking a sip of coffee. His hands shook slightly, and Anna recognized in him the same quiet sorrow she had seen in Peter. He explained that Peter had been injured by a roadside blast. Shrapnel to the leg, bruised ribs, and hearing damage. He spent weeks recovering in a civilian clinic run by Vietnamese staff, nurses, doctors who had little in the way of resources. One of those nurses was a young woman named Lynn. "You see," Ellis said, a tinge of fondness in his voice. "She was fearless. She patched up wounds that would have made others faint." Peter was smitten. According to Ellis, the two formed a deep bond in that clinic. At some point, Lynn became pregnant. Peter vowed he would bring her and the baby back to the U.S. He forged documents, bribed local officials, did everything in his power to secure a place for them on one of the last flights out before the area became too dangerous. But war rarely follows plans. The night before they were set to leave, Lynn's village was shelled. She and the baby disappeared in the chaos. The official records eventually listed her as presumed dead, though no one could confirm her fate. Peter, heartbroken, refused to accept the finality. He wrote letters to her, never mailing them, simply storing them in the hopes that someday, somehow, they might be delivered. Ellis admitted he was the one who tried to get embassy contacts to look for Lynn, but the channels were overwhelmed, and everyone told them it was futile. Eventually, Ellis wrote that letter about the evac failed, trying to keep track of the situation. But nothing panned out. Anna listened, tears sliding down her cheeks. She felt heartbreak not just for herself, but for Peter, for the man she knew in old age who had carried this sorrow in silence. She imagined him as a young soldier, writing letters to a woman he loved and a child he might never see. Her gaze dropped to the ring, which glinted in the afternoon sunlight. Lynn. He wore that name every day, perhaps as an act of remembrance or an unspoken promise. She asked if Peter ever tried to find them again after the war ended. Ellis nodded. He wanted to go back in the 90s once travel restrictions were eased. But his health was failing by then. The VA wouldn't clear him for that long flight. He was furious, wrote letters to congressmen, but eventually gave up. I guess his lungs and heart were in bad shape. He once told me it was the biggest regret of his life. Ellis looked at Anna with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know he loved you. I remember him talking about you when you first started dating. But he never forgot Lynn." Before she left, Ellis handed her one more envelope. "He gave this to me a while back," he said. "Told me that if you ever came looking, I was to give it to you." The envelope read, "If found, for Anna." Her heart squeezed as she recognized Peter's handwriting. She said goodbye to Ellis, who squeezed her hand in a gesture of comfort, then returned to her hotel. She spent hours pacing the small room, building up the courage to open the envelope. When she finally did, her tears came before she'd even read the first line. "My love, there's something I never said. There was a woman once. A child, maybe. I thought I lost them. Then I met you, and I realized the world still had light in it. I never stopped wondering, never stopped remembering, but I never stopped loving you. If this letter finds you, it means you found the ring. I engraved her name not because I loved her more, but because I made her a promise. I kept it the only way I knew how. Yours always, Peter." Anna's sobs shook her shoulders. She clutched the letter to her chest, feeling a complex swirl of emotions. Sadness, relief, understanding, and yes, even love. She wasn't angry. She felt heartbroken for him, for Lynn, for a child who might have been lost to war. She understood that he had tried to keep his memories from tainting their life together. In a sense, he had built a new future with her, while carrying a secret heartbreak that never fully left him. He'd had no way to reconcile that world and this one. She could have ended her search there. She had enough answers to piece together the broad strokes of Peter's hidden past. But something in the letter ignited her determination. "I never stopped wondering," he had written, and Anna realized that she too couldn't walk away. If there was even the faintest chance that Lynn or the child survived, Anna wanted to know. She wanted to fulfill a mission that Peter couldn't. She returned to Minneapolis and, over the next few weeks, enlisted the help of a Vietnamese-American historian from the local university. His name was Dr. Nguyen, and he specialized in wartime migrations and refugee records. At first, he was skeptical that they would find anything after so many decades. But Anna showed him the photo, the letter, and explained all she knew. He saw the raw urgency in her eyes and agreed to help. Together, they spent countless nights sorting through microfilms, old embassy documents, and archived refugee lists from the 1970s. It was grueling work, full of dead ends and incomplete files. Sometimes Anna would come home near midnight, her eyes burning from the strain, the ring with Lynn's name on her finger like a silent reminder of why she persisted. She learned more about the harrowing circumstances of evacuations, the chaos in the final days of American involvement. Families were split, records destroyed, countless individuals simply vanished in the turmoil. Dr. Nguyen explained that many refugees changed their names upon arrival in the U.S., often adopting Americanized spellings or entirely different identities for safety. This meant Anna had to search not only for Lynn, but for possible variations. Still, she clung to hope, spurred on by the knowledge that Peter never gave up. She felt as though she were walking in his footsteps, chasing a promise left unfulfilled. Several months passed. The winter snows melted into spring. Then the summer heat set in. Each day that yielded no new information frustrated Anna further, but she refused to quit. She read old war diaries, watched documentaries, and pored over transcripts of congressional hearings. Sometimes Dr. Nguyen teased her that she was becoming more knowledgeable about post-war refugee resettlements than he was. She only nodded, pressing forward. She wanted closure not just for Peter, but for herself. To understand the kind of man she had married in full. To see if Lynn had survived, and if the child, if indeed that baby was Peter's, had grown into adulthood. Finally, a breakthrough arrived in the form of an old asylum record from 1978. A woman named Lynn Tran had entered the U.S. through a special refugee program. The date of birth, 1946, matched the approximate age that Anna estimated from the photo. However, Lynn Tran was listed as deceased in 2001. The file didn't explain the cause of death, only that she passed away in a hospital in Washington state. Anna stared at the screen, absorbing the weight of it. Lynn had made it to America after all. She'd been alive on the same soil as Peter for decades, yet they never reunited. The tragedy of it pressed on Anna's heart. But the file contained one more crucial piece. Lynn Tran had arrived with a dependent, a child born in 1970, named Peter Tran. The boy would have been 8 years old when they entered the country. Anna's pulse quickened. He was likely in his 50s now if he was still alive. She scribbled down every detail. The approximate date of arrival, the local resettlement agency that sponsored them, the region they settled in. With Dr. Nguyen's help, they traced that child's later records. They found a mention of a Peter Tran living outside Seattle. 54 years old. No easily available contact details, but enough leads to attempt to reach him. Anna composed a letter late one night, her mind spinning with how to phrase it. How do you tell a stranger that your husband might have been his father? She wrote draft after draft, trying to find the right balance of honesty and compassion. Finally, she settled on a simple explanation. Your mother's name was Lynn Tran. She arrived in the U.S. in 1978 with a young boy named Peter. I believe my husband, Peter Stillwell, was your father. He served in Vietnam and lost contact with your mother. He died recently and I found clues about his life there. He never forgot you, though he was led to believe you didn't survive. I know this might be overwhelming, but please know I reach out in good faith. If you are not the right person, please forgive me for intruding. She included her phone number, her address, and a photocopy of the picture showing Peter and Lynn holding a baby. Then she mailed it to the address they believed belonged to Peter Tran. After that, she waited, each day feeling like an eternity. She tried to go about her normal routines, attending church, volunteering, meeting friends for coffee, but her mind was consumed by questions. Would he respond? Would he dismiss her as a crank? Perhaps he already knew his father's identity and wanted nothing to do with that chapter of history. 1 month later, an envelope arrived. There was no return address, but the Seattle postmark made Anna's heart race. She tore it open with trembling hands. Inside was a single page, typed, I never knew his name. My mother spoke only of a kind soldier who tried his best. She said we had to flee under terrible circumstances. I grew up wondering if I had been forgotten. Now I know I wasn't. Thank you for reaching out. It was signed simply, Peter Tran. Anna's relief flooded her in a sob. She clutched the letter to her chest, feeling the same swirl of emotions she'd experienced when reading Peter's final note. This man, Peter Tran, was alive. He had grown up thinking no father was searching for him, but in reality, Peter Stillwell had carried that longing until the day he died. Anna blinked away tears, imagining how different life might have been if her Peter had known that Lynn survived, that their child reached the U.S. She mourned for the happiness that was stolen from them by war, and yet she felt a deep sense of peace knowing that her husband's child had lived. She wrote back immediately, sending more details, pictures of the older Peter, describing the man she knew. She included his final letter, explaining that he never stopped wondering if his child had survived. The phone call came a few weeks later, from a number with the Seattle area code. Anna picked up, her pulse hammering. A soft voice introduced himself as Peter Tran. They spoke for nearly an hour, exchanging cautious questions. He had grown up in Washington, raised by Lynn, who never remarried. She'd told him bits and pieces about his father, describing a gentle American soldier who tried to whisk them away from danger. But the war devoured that dream. He always assumed the father had abandoned them. Now, learning of the truth that his father believed them lost, shook him to the core. They continued communicating by phone and email, tentatively forging a connection that was both strange and strangely comforting. Anna found herself caring about this man as though he were her own kin, recognizing in him certain qualities that reminded her of Peter. Once, on a video call, she noticed he had a similar tilt to his head when listening. He told her about his mother, how she worked multiple jobs, rarely spoke about Vietnam, and did her best to raise him in a foreign land. She had taught him to speak both English and Vietnamese, though as an adult, he lost much of his fluency. She told him about how his father used to fix neighbors' fences, about his quiet ways of expressing love. Each story felt like bridging a gap in their shared history. Eventually, they decided to meet in person. They chose a cafe in Seattle, near where Peter Tran lived. Anna flew out again, taking a few days off from her part-time nursing job. Her nerves were on edge as she entered the small cafe that morning. The smell of freshly ground coffee filled the air, and soft jazz played overhead. She spotted him at a corner table, tall with streaks of gray in his hair, wearing a neat collared shirt. He stood up when he saw her, and they locked eyes for a moment. She noticed the resemblance. The same thoughtful gaze that Peter had when he studied something carefully, the same gentleness in the way he carried himself. He stepped forward. "Mrs. Stillwell?" he asked quietly. She felt tears prick her eyes. He was showing respect, but the formality stung her heart a little. She forced a smile and shook her head gently. "You can call me Anna," she said, her voice trembling. They took seats at the small table, ordering coffee they hardly touched. The conversation started with polite pleasantries. "How was your flight? How's the weather in Minnesota?" Both of them aware there was a deeper subject at hand. Anna reached into her purse and produced the ring with Lynn's name engraved. She placed it on the table between them. Peter Tran stared at it, an unspoken understanding crossing his face. "I can't believe he wore that ring," he murmured, touching it with a fingertip. "All these years, I assumed my father forgot us." Anna's breath shook. "He never forgot. He just didn't know you were alive." The air felt charged with the weight of all they'd lost. A father who never reunited with his son, a mother who fled alone, and a war that scattered them across continents. They talked in low tones for hours. She told him about Peter's life in Minneapolis, the kind deeds, the quiet mornings, his final struggle with heart disease. Peter Tran recounted his own childhood, how his mother taught him to read English by using old library books, how they rarely had enough money for extras, but she always made sure he had what he needed for school. At one point, Peter Tran hesitated, then pulled out a photo from his wallet. It was a picture of his mother, Lynn, in her later years, a tired but determined face, with lines of care etched around her eyes. She used to look at the horizon sometimes and say, "He tried," Peter Tran said. That was all she'd say about him. "I guess now I know what she meant." Anna reached across the table and gently touched his hand. That simple moment held the essence of what they had come to share, a quiet sorrow and a bond none of them had asked for, but which they accepted all the same. They decided to keep in touch. Anna wanted to give him the ring, but Peter Tran suggested a different idea. He felt that the ring and the story behind it belonged to a greater narrative than just the two of them. He mentioned that there was a Vietnam War archive in Seattle that collected personal artifacts and stories to help people understand the human cost of that conflict. Together, they arranged for the ring, the photograph of Peter and Lynn, and a copy of Peter's final letter to be displayed there. Anonymously at first, but eventually they agreed to attach names so others could learn from it. The exhibit was small but poignant, accompanied by a plaque that read, "Some promises are never spoken aloud, but they're kept, just the same." Anna stayed in Seattle for a few more days, exploring the city with Peter Tran, meeting his wife and grown children. She felt a pang of envy at times, imagining how proud her Peter would have been to see the family that sprang from that chance meeting in a war-torn country. But she also felt a sense of peace. She had followed her husband's footsteps, completed the journey he started. On her last day in Seattle, Peter Tran took her to a small park overlooking the water. They sat on a bench, letting the breeze rustle their hair. He said quietly, "I wish I could have met him." Anna wrapped her arm around his shoulders in a brief hug. She understood that longing all too well. When she returned to Minnesota, she found herself lighter, as though a profound weight had lifted. She went about her life volunteering, gardening, making her husband's favorite stew. People commented that she seemed more serene than she had been even before Peter's passing. She knew the reason. She had found the piece of Peter's heart he'd lost in Vietnam. She had shared his final love letter with the man it concerned most. The circle was unbroken. From time to time, she opened her jewelry drawer, where she kept her own wedding band, slightly worn from years of use, and next to it, she placed a second ring, polished smooth, Lynn's name still visible inside. She didn't need to wear it. Just seeing it reminded her that love could transcend ignorance, distance, and even the boundaries of war. She sometimes visited Peter's grave, placing fresh flowers and speaking softly to him, telling him about how his son was doing. She'd mention new developments, how Peter Tran's daughter had just graduated college, or how he'd started volunteering at a local refugee center, perhaps inspired by the story of his parents. She felt certain that if Peter were listening from somewhere, he'd be proud. She believed in the quiet conviction that he'd found peace at last, knowing the child he thought lost to the war had survived and carried forward the legacy of kindness that defined him. Over time, Anna and Peter Tran maintained their bond. They exchanged holiday cards, visited once or twice a year. He even traveled to Minnesota with his family, letting them see the house where his father had lived and the little workshop where Peter used to keep his tools. Standing in that workshop, Peter Tran ran his hand over a well-worn wooden table, reading the notches and scratches that told a story of decades' worth of home repairs and neighborly favors. He murmured, "He built things for people. Maybe that's where I get it." And Anna felt tears spring to her eyes. She realized that the memory of her husband lived on not just in her heart, but in the quiet resonance of the man who stood there, bridging past and present. In the end, the ring took its place in the Vietnam War archive, displayed behind glass alongside a photograph of Peter and Lynn in 1969, the baby in her arms, and a copy of Peter's final letter. Museum visitors would stop and read, some leaving in tears. A small plaque explained how war can separate families, how a single promise might sustain a lifetime of hope, and how love can endure even when words fail. Once, Anna attended a small ceremony at the archive, where a curator gave a brief talk about the objects. She stood at the back, quietly taking in the moment. She recognized that these relics were no longer just her story or Peter's. They belonged to a collective memory, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And so, her life continued. She grew older, her hair turned silver, and she found new ways to keep busy. Occasionally, she visited schools or community centers, speaking about the experiences of veterans and their families, sharing the gentle wisdom she'd gleaned from her decades with Peter. She never condemned him for the secrets he kept. She understood that some wounds run too deep to be fully revealed. Instead, she spoke of compassion, of how healing can come from stepping into the shadows we fear, and of how love can remain steadfast despite the jagged fault lines of history. Sometimes she would leaf through an album of old photographs, lingering on images of Peter and her in happier times. She'd pause on pictures from barbecues or fishing trips, smiling at his unassuming grin. Then she'd flip to pictures that had come later, like a snapshot of her and Peter Tran standing beside Peter's grave, arms around each other, forging a bond neither had expected. That single snapshot was evidence that even in the wake of tragedy, new connections could form, carrying forward the best parts of those who came before. In the quiet hours of the night, when she remembered Peter's last few weeks in the care center, she no longer felt only sorrow. She remembered the weight of his hand in hers, the warmth of his eyes. Yes, he had a life in Vietnam that she never knew during their 50 years of marriage, but that life shaped him into the gentle man she married. He'd been forged by heartbreak and war, yet he chose compassion at every turn. She believed he would have been overjoyed to see that the child he created with Lynn had grown into a caring adult. The ring with Lynn's name wasn't a betrayal. It was a promise, kept in the only way he knew how, by carrying that name against his skin every day. As the years passed, Anna found her own reflections on Vietnam changing, too. She no longer saw it as merely the place that stole something from Peter. She learned about its culture, its history, and she felt a sense of gratitude for Lynn, who nursed Peter back to health and gave him a glimmer of love in a war-torn environment. She recognized that Lynn's courage and sacrifice were part of the tapestry that led Anna and Peter to build a life together. Without Lynn, maybe Peter would have never discovered that love could exist, even in darkness. He came back from the war with scars, but also with a deeper capacity for empathy. Anna liked to think that in some strange way, Lynn and that baby helped shape the man who became her devoted husband. Toward the end of her own life, Anna would often spend evenings writing letters she never sent. She addressed some to Peter Stillwell, others to Lynn, some even to the child she now knew as Peter Tran. In them, she shared memories, regrets, and gratitude. It was a form of therapy for her, a way to gather all the fragments of her life into a coherent reflection. She stored these letters in a small box, thinking that maybe someday her nieces or nephews would discover them after she was gone, much as she had discovered Peter's secrets. She hoped they would read about the quiet soldier who carried heartbreak in a ring and about the wife who searched for the truth he left behind. Decades from now, if someone stumbles upon that box or visits the Vietnam War archive and sees the ring and the photograph, they will witness a story that transcends borders and decades. They will learn that love can persist through the darkest storms, that a single engraved name can bridge two worlds, and that sometimes the truest form of keeping a promise is not loud or dramatic but silent and steadfast, carried in the hollow of a ring or in the quiet spaces of the heart. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.